So we want to welcome everybody tonight to our webinar, Climate Migrants. I forget the rest of the title, Victims of, Paul, do you remember what it is?
Neglected victims of climate injustice.
Thank you. And tonight we have Paul Clements, and we also have Eileen Best, who is on our steering committee. And she is one of our at-large representatives on the steering committee of Presbyterians for Earth Care. So we will let Eileen introduce Paul and start us off with a prayer. Take it away, Eileen.
Okay, thank you. Welcome, everyone. Very happy to have all of you here tonight for this really important webinar. Um, Paul was the led of several adult classes at my church a couple months ago, and so that gave me the idea to invite him to come here and do this for all of us too. And I think you'll really enjoy this evening. Paul is a professor of political science at Western Michigan University in Kalamazoo, Michigan. You've probably seen on the publicity his biography. I won't go over all of it, but I think the most relevant thing is that about a year ago he organized and led a symposium on this topic, and there were over 100 presenters from 52 different countries. It was really massive, and an attempt to get everyone talking about climate migration and start to make some plans about this important topic. So welcome, Paul. We are eager to hear what you have to say. And let's open with the prayer, and then you may begin. Let's pray. Gracious God, we thank you for this evening, this time that we have together to learn about how to care better for your people around the world. Open our hearts as we consider this topic and open our minds to learning new things about our world and about climate migration. Amen.
Amen. So, shall I go ahead?
Yes, please go ahead.
Okay, well, first, thank you to everyone. Thanks to Eileen for that nice introduction, to Mindy for organizing, and to all of you for coming to this. I'm really delighted to talk about this topic. I think that climate change is the biggest challenge facing humanity right now, and we're not doing a good job on it. And so I want to talk about, to some extent, about what I think are better ways to approach it. And particularly with the challenge of climate migration. I think I'll say more about this, of course, but I think climate migrants, people displaced from their homes and livelihoods by climate change, represent the biggest population of really most unjustly treated people by effects of climate change. And there's very little being done today to address their needs. So that's kind of our topic. I know that speaking to this group that I'm speaking to people who've already been working on climate change and know about climate change for a long time. So I'm grateful I don't have to do any of the science because I know you know that stuff already. I don't know, some of you may have seen the January 25th presentation, particularly by Greg Brecky. Andrew Kang Bartlett also spoke, but Greg spoke a lot about just sort of the situation with climate migration, and mine, you can say, kind of comes at that same topic from a different angle. So I've given hundreds of presentations on climate change, but this one is different from any presentation I've ever given before. How is that? Well, I usually speak as a scholar and as an American citizen, as a climate activist, and I bring all those three things to it today. But I don't usually speak as a Christian, and I don't usually speak about the role of the church. And this is today. That's where I'm coming from, as will become apparent. Since I'm not used to speaking this way, if this is not terribly completely fluid sometimes, please bear with me. I think when we talk about climate change today, we need to recognize that in so many ways in our country and across the world, this is just really a dark time, putting even aside climate change, that politically and in terms of crisis of democracy, and you just turn on the news and it's like, what crisis are we going to hear about today with our current president? And it seems as though the sort of awareness of climate change, people kind of know about it, but it's less front and center than it even was a few years ago, even though the problems are really getting worse. So that makes it kind of hard to talk about a little bit. Um, uh, I'm going to speak to, even though things have gotten way worse under President Trump, I'm not going to speak to that so much. I'm going to speak to the long-term issues and the causes, and I think also in the long term, what I think needs to be done. So I want to start off with an overview. I'm going to first talk about the problem of climate justice and what I think is needed. And then I'm going to talk about why I think the church should speak for climate migrants, and also why this is difficult, because I think it is very difficult. Um, I think it's important for this presentation for me to tell a little bit more about myself. So I'm going to give a particular version of my story, why I'm speaking to you today on this message. And then at that point, I'll turn to a PowerPoint presentation and give a brief history of international negotiations on climate change and how the international community came to neglect climate migrants. And then, as I mentioned in the sort of biomaterial, the international community for many years has been using a number of, well, there could be 200 million or so climate migrants by 2050. And my research has found that that number is just definitely not correct. And that if we try to sort of make a good estimate, a better estimate, if we're going to talk about, what we should be preparing for as we move to 2050, 500 million would be a much closer estimate than 200 million. And it could be worse than that. It could be a little bit better than that. But for policy perspective, that's actually quite an important number. And then I'll come back at the end to come back to what I think is needed for global climate justice. So that's where we're going. And my core argument about climate justice is actually pretty simple. And that is that when we think of social justice issues are about the distribution of the rights and duties of social cooperation. And because carbon pollution is global, we share one atmosphere, climate justice is inherently a global issue. And what we've seen is that we in the United States and other developed countries have benefited from production of carbon pollution with our industrialization. And most of the harms from what we've done to benefit from that have fallen and will fall, partly certainly on future generations, but also definitely on people in developing countries, and particularly some countries more than others. And so the problem of climate justice, as I see it, is that we in the United States and other developed countries, we don't bear responsibility, and no one's holding us accountable for the harms that we're imposing from the way we benefit. We and some individuals, some companies and so on, benefit from our carbon pollution for all the harms that we're imposing on other people, again, particularly in developing countries. And and so I think that the reason, or one way to talk about the reason that climate action globally is failing is that we don't have that responsibility. No one's holding us accountable. No one's making people, sort of pay the cost of the harms they're creating with their carbon pollution for all the benefits they get from burning the carbon fuels. And I think that we have to somehow address that problem at the international level. So that's where I'm going to be going with this presentation. Part of the problem here in the United States is that I've been very involved in climate action for a long time. I mean, certainly for well over a decade. And the discourse on climate change in the United States and on climate justice even is very much 99% nationally oriented. People are concerned about how we reduce our carbon pollution, about neglected, victimized communities here in the United States, and all those are important issues. But most Americans don't have the frame of reference for the international negotiations that are where the key sort of location where responsibilities and action is worked out globally. And so the discussion, if we look at our Earth Care group at First Pres that my wife has been involved in, I'd have a climate change working group at my university. I've been very involved with Kalamazoo Climate Crisis Coalition. The discussion is 99% Kalamazoo, Michigan, United States. If we look at the big organizations, Sierra Club, League of Conservation Voters, national climate justice, climate change organizations, environmental organizations, they're overwhelmingly focused on the national perspective, with very, very little discussion of the harms we're imposing on other people in other countries. And so that makes it, that makes it a tough question. So who are climate migrants? Well, just in terms of definitions, climate migrants are people who are displaced from their homes and livelihoods by effects of climate change. Um, in the sort of discourse on these, we talk about slow onset and sudden onset causes. Slow onset causes would be usually drought and sea level rise. Sudden onset causes would be mostly storms and floods at this point of time. Almost the overwhelming majority of people who are climate migrants want to stay in their home country. They don't want to leave their country. Why would they want to leave their country? It's usually if it's just not feasible to stay in their home country that they would go somewhere else. And so the sort of standard situation is they're going from a rural situation, often agricultural situation, to an urban slum, because that's where they can go to. And they often are destitute when they come to these urban slums. So they've lost their livelihoods. So often they need even basic sanitation support, education, health facilities, housing. But the key thing is livelihoods. They've lost their livelihood. And again, this was not their choice. This is something that essentially the developed countries imposed on them. And their governments do not make them a priority. If we want to think about countries, you might think about Bangladesh, Somalia, Guatemala, the Philippines. Each country has its own different sort of set of issues, but there are some common issues. So again, we'll talk more about the numbers and stuff later on. I think that the international community is failing not only on climate migration, but also on mitigation and adaptation. So I pay a lot of attention to these international negotiations and the common language. These are the terms that get used. Is mitigation, you're probably familiar with it, is like what we do to reduce our carbon pollution, getting down to net zero. And adaptation is what we can do to reduce the harm as time goes on from the effects of climate change. And so mitigation and adaptation have been sort of the big categories. The international community has not talked much about climate migrants. It's just coming into now wide discussion. As I'll say later on, there is a new discussion about harm and damage from climate change in the international negotiations. But again, the central problem is that there's no institutionally enforced accountability for these harms. And to get that accountability, we would have to have stronger global governance in ways that I'll talk about. And that's not a popular topic for a lot of people. But I'll come back to that. It's certainly a political non-starter today. It would not be possible to do the kind of things that I'm talking about. And so partly then, because it's not viable to move forward on the real issues of climate governance that are needed, stronger climate governance and mitigation, adaptation, and so on, I think it makes kind of a strategic sense to focus attention on the population that's most victimized, climate migrants, and on our responsibility for climate migrants. And it turns out that from a strategic perspective, to increase action on climate migrants might not be as hard as you would think. And the reason for that is that in the international negotiations, the UNFCCC, United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which is a big sort of talking shop, and the forum for international negotiations, they have come together first with $100 billion per year, a target that was set a long time ago, but was achieved in 2022. And then in 2024, they increased that target to $300 billion per year. And they achieved the 100 billion, more than that. But this money is going for mitigation and adaptation, and virtually none of it is going to support climate migrants. I think the simple reason for that is that climate migrants don't have any political support. But whatever about the reason, it's not happening. And so the immediate task is not to generate new money, but to get some of that money that's already been either committed or is already in the works and have that shifted to support the most victimized community by the effects. And I think that would be possible, although of course not easy. So because we're talking about increasing the accountability of particularly the United States and other developed countries, I think the message has to come from American citizens that we can't expect climate migrants to effectively promote their own interests, maybe for pretty obvious reasons. It's got to be Americans telling our government that, hey, we've caused this. We need to take some responsibility. We need to step up. Um, and I think, frankly, that there's no institution that's better placed to do that than the church. There are others who could also do it, but I think the church has a real role there. And I'll say more about that. Um, when I say the church should do this, I recognize that it's very difficult. I recognize it's difficult for any kind of even climate justice organization. And that is because the church and the Sierra Club and all these climate change organizations, we're all membership-based organizations. And so the leadership can't just do what it wants. The leadership has to work with what the members want. And the members usually want to do stuff where they can get their hands dirty, so to speak, where they can work on issues they can engage with personally and see an effect. Climate migrants are so far away, and the international discourse is people are not familiar with international negotiations and how that works. And so the idea of influencing that and influencing our government policy seems like something off in the stars, not something people feel they could possibly do. And so I understand that membership organizations have a very hard time addressing problems like this. But I still think it's necessary and important. And also I should say that I could help, you know. I actually do have I have a full-time job. I'm a professor, I teach, and I have a number of projects. But I think this is really important. And you know, if people wanted to work to see how the church could do this, I do have some ideas. Okay, so why am I bringing this message to you today? Here I want to tell you a little bit about my personal story that's not on my CV, to help to give some idea of where I'm coming from with this. And I'll start from my mom and dad. They were both born in East Texas. My mom's father was a postmaster. My dad's father was a pipe fitter with Shell Oil. Somehow my mom became a committed Christian. That just happens sometimes. And they met at University of Texas, where they were both involved with Christian Faith and Life Community. And my dad used to go up to Alaska each summer and work on building houses. We got to be a union carpenter. And so after they got married, they needed, well, for their honeymoon, they took an unusual honeymoon. They did a 6-month work camp in the Philippines, building a community center with the Methodist Church. So that kind of started that kind of life for them. When they went back, my dad got his master's in social work. My mom went on and attended seminary, even though the Methodist Church was not ordaining women at that time. When she went to seminary, what she got out of that, just to oversimplify, is that she felt that as a Christian, she should be serving the poorest of the poor. And that's been a sort of a theme in her life. They ended up then going back to the Board of Global Ministries, and they were going to be sent to Congo, which then became Zaire and is now Congo again. And this was in 1961. That happens to be the year that I was born. But that year, Patrice Lumumba in the Congo was assassinated, and there was terrible civic violence. And so it was not going to be possible for them. They had to nix that idea. So the board says, okay, well, we'll send you to Hong Kong. How about that? So to work with, at that time, refugees coming out of China. So they had a year of language study. And then in 1963, when I was 2, my family moved to Hong Kong. And that was where I lived for 11 years. So while we were in Hong Kong, the Christian Faith and Life community, some of their leaders, moved to Chicago. And they started a family order, a religious order called the Order Ecumenical, also Ecumenical Institute. And they were interested in church renewal. And they were teaching religious study weekend courses and also summer programs. And their basic course was called RS1. And I'll come back to that. But they started teaching around the United States and then around the world. And when they came to Hong Kong, they would stay in our apartment because they were friends. My parents became leaders of their local action in Hong Kong. And then when I was 10, in 1971, our family joined the order. And another couple of families moved into our apartment. And that was then our life. So it turned out then that I got to attend this RS1 program as a kid several times, because that's just kind of what you had to do. And in this weekend course, we have study papers by Paul Tillich, by Dietrich Bonhoeffer, by Rudolf Bultmann, and H. Richard Niebuhr. I remember those very well, even from so many years ago. And I'm going to say a little bit about the paper by H. Richard Niebuhr. That was the last paper on Sunday morning, and it was entitled "The Church as Social Pioneer." And Niebuhr's big concept was representational responsibility, that the church should take responsibility for the sins of society by identifying the most serious sins and working on that essentially. And in sort of theological language, we used to say, hear the word of God, see his judgment, have the vision of the resurrection. But it's not so different from what I hear at First Pres from the pulpit most every week. And that is the church is a body of Christ promoting God's justice. That's our job as Christians. The one thing that's maybe a little bit different from Niebuhr is to see, well, what is society particularly neglecting? And here's where I think that climate justice really fits the bill. Because certainly here in the United States, people do not make a priority of climate justice. They're not aware of the harms that we're imposing on people all over the world and of our responsibility for these harms. And I think that that's something that the church could speak to. So, I was with the order, and then taking these courses and so on. And then in 1975, my mom got her wish to work with the poorest of the poor. The Methodist Church sent them, my parents, to Bombay to work in the slums of Bombay for all the outreach programs of the Methodist Church there. And that, if you've ever been to the slums of Bombay, or if you've seen Slumdog Millionaire or anything, that's some of the most serious poverty in the world. There were people living at their house in Bombay was the Bombay House for the order, so it had a few families living in it. And on the street out front, there were literally people living and dying on the street. I was in New Delhi to go to the American Embassy School, but all my holidays would be either with my folks in Bombay or else at that time the order was starting village development projects, and I spent a lot of time helping out in these various village development projects. And it was through working in these village development projects and seeing the poverty in India that I got my interest in international development. And if you've seen from my sort of bio, that's then been my career throughout my career has been working on international in college, and ever since college, that has been a central focus for me. So I'm going to jump ahead now. I got to be a lot of other steps, but then I became a professor at Western Michigan University, teaching international development, and it became clear that in the international development field, that the biggest challenge is climate change. Things were getting better in developing countries, but now because of climate change, they're getting worse in so many different countries, and this has to be addressed. So here I'm going to share my screen and give a brief overview of the international situation on climate justice. Why we have my climate migrants as neglected victims. So this is just a few highlights, but international climate action got started in 1992 when the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change was established. The United States and about almost 200 countries were involved in that. They've been meeting almost every year since then. And the 1992 document agreement has really good principles. It recognized developed countries' responsibility, that developed countries need to take the lead on mitigation, that we need to help developing countries with their mitigation, their moving to renewable energy, with their adaptation. But it didn't have any requirements. So it had good principles, but no teeth, so to speak. There was an attempt through Kyoto Protocol that just didn't amount to much, so I'm not going to talk about that. But the next big event in the international negotiations really was not until 2009 with the Copenhagen Accords that the meeting of the Conference of Parties, the COP meeting, was in Copenhagen, Denmark that year. And that was the year when they promised $100 billion per year target to support developing countries with mitigation adaptation by the year 2020. So they're going to be increasing it gradually to have 100 billion by 2020. Then in 2015, we got the very famous Paris Agreement. That was the first time that the countries of the world agreed to a specific target. We said we're going to limit our global warming to try to reach limited to 1.5 degrees warming compared to pre-industrial, and definitely below 2 degrees of warming. Except that there were, again, no relationship to any country's responsibility for how much they're going to reduce their carbon pollution, and there are no specific requirements. It's all based on nationally determined contributions in the Paris Agreement. That means each country just says, okay, this is what I'm going to do, but it's not related to any formula or anything. And then if you don't do what you say you're going to do, there's no consequence. And so we have seen that climate action has been inadequate, and the Paris Agreement, as the international agreement, being all voluntary, I think that helps to explain why it has not been effective. Also, in the Paris Agreement, there was agreement to have the climate finance, and even emphasis on mitigation and adaptation, basically because the developed countries want to push for more mitigation, but the developing countries say we need adaptation. And so they agreed to have it roughly even though they haven't achieved that. So they didn't reach the target in 2020, but they did by 2022 exceed the $100 billion per year target in climate finance from developed countries supporting developing countries. It's not, they say it's 120 billion. There's some accounting tricks there, so it's probably not really 120 billion, but it is real money. And there's a lot of programs with that. It's going through the traditional development agencies like the World Bank, Global Environment Facility. There is a Green Climate Fund, but it has that's set up by UNFCCC, but it's pretty small. In 2023, there was an agreement for the first time to set up a loss and damage fund to help developing countries for the losses that cannot be adapted to, where there's no adaptation. But number one, even as of today, the commitments are less than $1 billion. And number two, they haven't started spending that money. The loss and damage fund for the first time includes language about supporting people who are essentially climate migrants. There's no reason that we could support climate migrants under adaptation. It would fit. There's no reason we couldn't do it under adaptation, but they just didn't choose to use adaptation money for climate migrants because the governments want other things. Then in 2024, the COP was held in Baku, and there they set a new finance goal for $300 billion target for 2035. That's how they do these things. They set these goals sort of long in advance. And the developing countries were asking for 1.3 trillion for 1,300 billion. And in terms of what's needed, that's a more reasonable figure for what's needed. But the developed countries said, well, no, we're not going to go to that much. We can say we can commit to 300 billion, and even then we'll have to wait and see how that comes. But there is this $300 billion target that even though our current president is, obviously would not get involved in that, we can imagine that under a new president, we might see that. So the basic sort of overview today, in the last couple of years, there's been a lot more discussion about climate migrants, and my symposium helped to promote that, but still virtually no funds have gone to support climate migrants. So I mentioned in my bio, the symposium that's talked about there, I won't review that, but also in November of 2024, I had an article about international climate migrant policy and estimates of climate migration. I will say it's had now over 11,000 views, which for an academic paper is pretty good. But I wrote that paper because the international community, in trying to understand the problem of climate migration, was using this number of 200 million or around 200 million by 2050. And that number came from a World Bank publication. And that publication, it turns out, is just wrong. So in my program, I started teaching a class on managing challenges from climate change back in 2019, and I teach this every fall. And at the end of this class, I talk about mitigation, adaptation, the international systems, and I always end up with a couple weeks or a few weeks on climate migration. So I've been following these discussions, and the World Bank came out with a publication called Groundswell. In 2018, they did their first, and then they did another follow-up in 2021. And this was the first study that used actual statistics to do a statistically rigorous estimate of future climate migrants by 2050. And because it's the World Bank, everyone started using their numbers. And that's where the number of something like 200 million came from. But when I looked at this study back in 2018, I'm a serious scholar. I read their methodology, and their methodology was not correct for if you want to look at an estimate of total climate migrants. And I thought, well, this is a big problem because soon the United Nations, our US government, the European Union, all the international organizations were all using these World Bank groundswell numbers. The numbers were just wrong. So that's where this paper came from. Um, so uh, so let me go into that then. So this was their 2021. In 2018, they just did 3 of these regions. They just did the analysis for Sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, and South Asia. Then they added the other regions in 2021. So I'll just look at the 2021 report and I'll read it. By 2050, without concrete climate and development action, climate change could lead to more than 216 million people in 6 regions to migrate within their own countries. So they're looking at within their own countries, right? And this was sort of the headline number and the headline conclusion that everyone was picking up. But that's wrong. Why is that wrong? It's wrong because their analysis is only based on 3 drivers of displacement and only 3 slow onset drivers. What they do is they get data on these 3 drivers from 1980 to 2010 and how these variables basically correlate with, through regression analysis, people moving from place to place. And then they project that through to 2050. And the three drivers they look at are: 1, water availability in terms of cubic meters per second of river discharge; 2, crop production in terms of yields and tons per hectare of maize, wheat, rice, and soybeans; and 3, sea level rise in terms of population living on land up to 1 or 2 meters above sea level, respectively, for low and high-end climate change scenarios. So you could say, well, okay, how good is the data? Basically, the first 2, drought, river discharge, and crop production, they're essentially proxies for drought. When you have more drought, then this is what you see, and then sea level rise. And these have long been recognized as important drivers. But the problem is they're clearly not the only drivers. There are clearly many other drivers of displacement. This doesn't even mention sudden onset drivers. Plus, then, do we really expect just a sort of linear relationship from the period 1980 to 2010 up through 2050? So there's also a problem with their sea level data. And I'm looking at the time, and I'm just going to skip over that. Basically, their sea level data is using satellite data that turns out to be wrong. And so the numbers of displaced by sea level would be a lot more than what they've estimated. And you can read my paper or come back to this slide if you want to for that. But whatever about that, that's not the main thing. So in my paper, I'm looking at just, we don't have statistics data on the other drivers, and that's a concern. But we can do a logical estimate based on what we do know of the other drivers. And so if we take their number for crop loss, reduced river flows, and sea level rise, and start off with roughly 220 million, then from sudden onset weather disasters, floods and storms, there's a lot of information about this from different sources. And this, you still have to make an estimate, but a reasonable estimate would be something in the area of 180 million by 2050. We already have tens of millions. We don't really know how many we have today, but it's already certainly quite a few. Increasing heat, this is one of these things where we know that so many places are going to get to be basically too hot to work outside. Maybe in heat waves, it could be too hot to live. And it's logical to think that in places like Bombay and New Delhi, where I can remember sleeping outside because it was too hot to sleep in my room. And now these days, they're getting some of the worst heat waves in the world, that when places just get to be too hot to work, people are going to leave. And also heat affects elderly people more seriously. And if you're elderly and you're retired and the place is too hot to live, you'll go somewhere else. So I estimate 63 million. Other slow onset loss of pasturage is a big issue in a lot of places. Somalia, all across a whole swath of Africa. People depend on they have cattle and goats and things. They move around, and when all the grass dies, then they have to sell all their animals die, and they're moving into basically slums. And so if we look at the different causes, then a sort of a reasonable estimate is we're talking about 500 million, not 200 million by 2050. And that would be about 5% of the global population. And this is the kind of thing where when a few people come into an urban slum, they can probably find some work. But when those numbers get to be in the tens and hundreds of thousands, then their needs, if they're not addressed, are much more serious. And again, this is something that they didn't want, that we have sort of caused. Also, if these issues aren't addressed, then their skills and their what economists call human capital is just going to be wasted, and they need new livelihoods so they can use their, they can work and they can be productive and make and do for their families. And that requires, and we kind of know how we could do that in a lot of these places, but we're not doing that. So my numbers are based on the official science, and I won't go into this one, but I think the official science is actually pretty conservative. And James Hansen, the very famous American climate scientist, argues that there's going to be a lot more. He's been critiquing these official numbers for more than 20 years. He thinks there's going to be much more global heating, much more sea level rise than the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the official numbers suggest. But whatever about that. Also, these numbers don't take account of conflict and state failure, but as water crises get to be more serious and such, I think we can expect more conflict and state failure from these. That might cause additional migration not considered in these numbers. So, so the basic point here is that this is something which the international community needs to be responding to. The governments of these countries can't do it. They don't have the resources. They don't have the political push. So what is the stronger global climate governance that we need? Well, in terms of limiting global warming, let's say if we've already basically, I think, passed the 1.5-degree target. That's not possible. I really doubt that the 2-degree target is plausible at this point. But if we wanted to talk about the 2-degree target, the way to talk about that is that the science tells us, so right now, globally, we're emitting about 38 billion tons, 38 gigatons of carbon dioxide a year. And so the sort of global budget for 2 degrees Celsius is about 950 gigatons additionally. So sort of this is just the official science, and these are not exact numbers, these are not exact relationships, but this is what the IPCC, the official science, tells us is from today, if we can limit our additional carbon pollution to 950 gigatons, then we'd have a pretty good chance of limiting global warming to 2 degrees Celsius. If we really wanted to do that, we'd say, all right, that's our global carbon budget. Let's then divide that among the countries of the world in some reasonably fair way. And then any country that exceeds their target, then sanction those countries for the harm they're imposing on other people. Because when you have more carbon pollution, you're not just hurting yourself, you're hurting the whole world. So the international community should impose basically punishment or sanction on countries that exceed a fair target. And I think that's the most plausible way to reduce to limit to fix up the weaknesses of the current UNFCCC. Then we still need increased funding from developed countries to help developing countries with mitigation, adaptation, loss, and damage. And so basically, I sort of agree with developing countries that it should be more like 1.3 trillion by 2035, not the 300 billion. But whatever about that, whatever number it is, it shouldn't be just voluntary. That this is something that America has caused, and we should pay for the harms and so that we need an international organization that can impose taxes on developed countries for their fair share and sanction countries that don't pay. And then finally, today, even if we had the money, the institutions for adaptation, for supporting climate migrants aren't there. The money that's being spent for adaptation, sadly, we know it's not being spent very well. It's not going to the highest need. It's not being spent efficiently. And there's not yet anything to be done for climate migrants. And these are things you can't just start up in 1 year. These things, you have to build the capacity, the bureaucratic institutional capacity to do these things. And that's a long-term thing. So that's partly why I think we should be pushing for capacity to support climate migrants from yesterday. And then finally, we need to recognize international climate migrants as refugees, something like refugees with enforceable rights. This is a whole nother discussion. I haven't really talked about the background here, but the Geneva Convention after World War II defined refugees in terms of people who fear to go back to their home country for some good reason. And people displaced by climate don't count as refugees in the international agreements, so they don't get those supports. And uh, because again, people are only pretty much leaving their home countries when they're forced out and they don't have a viable place to stay at home. And I think that we need to have some kind of international recognition protecting the rights of international climate migrants in the receiving countries. I completely realize that this political agenda is a complete non-starter today. But I think we need to start from the perspective of what is climate justice? What does it look like? And then how do we move for that to that? And again, it seems to me that the first strategic priority is to promote developed country responsibility for climate migrants as responsibility, not charity. And that there would be very clear strategic ways to do this. And the question I want to leave us with is how can the church support this? And at that, I will stop sharing. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Paul. I guess we should open this up for some questions. Eileen, did you want me to help you with moderating that or?
Sure, why don't you go ahead, Mindy?
Okay. So if anyone has a question, if you know how to raise your hand on the screen, you can go down below and go to react if it says react and you can raise your hand. If we have somebody raising a hand. If you don't know how to do that, then we will figure out a way to get you recognized here. Maybe I will I'm gonna remove Paul's spotlight. There we go, so we can see. Okay, so Mary,
Yes,
is that your, am
that's,
I saying that correctly? Okay.
you are
Go
indeed.
ahead.
Yes. So, very fascinating presentation, Paul. It really gets the brain thinking differently. And your last point on the last slide was, I have some ideas about the church. Please share some of your ideas.
So if we want the developed countries to do a better job supporting climate migrants, and if the immediate thing is to get some of that money that's already being allocated from developed countries for developing countries, then the thing to do would be to help to develop project proposals that could actually be implemented. For example, with the Green Climate Fund, or for example, with the Global Environment Facility. These are the sort of current channels for that money to be spent. And right now, you can go online and see all the projects they're funding, and they're not funding climate migrant projects. So to do this is partly why I held that climate migrant symposium, to sort of, see who's out there. But like, for example, just to give an example, in Bangladesh, which has, we know, hundreds of thousands of climate migrants in Bangladesh, they have a very long history of very powerful NGOs, non-government organizations. And for example, BRAC is one of the biggest nonprofits in the world. And they have a long history of very effective work with people in poverty in their countries. And they're doing a few things with German funding on supporting climate migrants, but that could be so much expanded. And so just as an example, identifying who would be the partners and what would be the good principles, and then working with them to develop project proposals, and then also working from the other end, from the political end, to say, all right, let's be sure that when these proposals go to Global Environment Facility, when they go to the Green Climate Fund, when they go to, okay, we don't have USAID because President Trump, got rid of USAID, our foreign aid, but when we have foreign aid again, go to our Congress and say, listen, this is something that needs to be supported, and sort of work from both ends towards the middle. I think that it would take, some obviously somewhat coordinated group, but I could imagine groups, because right now I did the entire climate migrant symposium from my office from Kalamazoo. I didn't have a single trip anywhere. So all this work can be done through Zoom. You don't have to go to these places. And so you could sort of build a committee that could meet just like this committee is meeting. And that's one idea.
Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. I forgot to mention you could also put your questions in the chat. I forgot to mention that option. Maybe Eileen can keep an eye on that. Does anyone else want to ask Paul a question or comment on what he talked about?
There seems to be a hand for Steve.
Steve? Oh, I don't see him. Steve, do you want to unmute and ask your question?
I didn't have one actually.
Oh, okay.
There's just a hand there. I was wondering.
Oh, really? Oh, okay.
It was a fluke.
Yep.
Up, Fred. Fred, you'll have to unmute.
Yes, this is Fred Milligan. I'm the co-facilitator of our PEC advocacy committee, and I've been very involved since 2021 with attending the annual COPs and staying on top of the UNFCCC process. So I really appreciate hearing from you on this issue of climate migration. I've been to several seminars in those international meetings around this topic, and glad to see that we're looking at this now. You may be aware, I don't know, about the overtures that are being brought to this assembly around climate and environmental justice. Are you familiar with them?
Yeah, I'm familiar with the Task Force on Displacement and with the Platform on Disaster Displacement and the Global Center for Climate Mobility. These were all involved in my symposium from a couple years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And since October 2024, I know I haven't been keeping up because I'm writing a book. I have to teach classes.
Yeah. I understand. Maybe we can have a conversation offline about this.
Yeah.
But we are bringing three specific overtures to
Mhm.
this assembly, General Assembly, that starts in a couple of weeks, and one of them is calling for a fossil fuel divestment from as part of the transition away from fossil fuels, to encourage that and do our part in that, and to no longer continue contributing to the harms that burning of fossil fuels causes, and by trying to do our part for cutting back in the production of those. The other overture is having to do with it's establishing an endowment for giving grants for different projects related to climate issues, climate damage, and so forth. I could imagine, as I listen to you, that we could, if we get this fund established, it could perhaps make grants for the kind of thing I hear you discussing for developing projects, that maybe developing a larger grant to Green Climate Fund or what have you, or Loss and Damage Fund, um, so that could be like a two-stage process. And then we're also doing an overture on regenerative agriculture, which is also very important as we look at the damages that are happening to the earth, and also trying to repair and stop damaging as much as we continue to do with our current agricultural practices. But maybe we can speak offline about that. But I just wondered if you were aware of those overtures, and
So these are overtures to which organization?
to the General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church.
Yeah, no, I think that first one, I mean, obviously I support all of them.
Yeah.
But I'm delighted to hear this. I've never been to a General Assembly. Um, but your idea for the first one, in terms of seed money, I can really see that. I'd be happy to talk about that.
Oh, the endowment fund.
Yeah, yeah.
Yes, yes. Terrific. Let's have a conversation about that.
Cool.
I'll get your phone number from Mindy if I can.
Okay. Eileen, did we have anything in the chat that you want to read?
Yes. There's a question from Jeff saying, how do you see local churches raising this issue in their congregations?
So I do think that that the best way to raise consciousness is through practical engagement. And so rather than starting sort of a wide consciousness raising thing, although I wouldn't be against that, I would want to start to organize something like what Fred is talking about in terms of sort of building the foundations for an organization that could do some practical action. And I recognize that among our congregants, probably 95% of our congregants would say, "What are you talking about?" But we actually have 5% of our congregants for whom this would actually kind of make sense. They're kind of, "Oh yeah, I know how these things work. I've done funding, I've done projects like that before." And so they wouldn't probably all be in one church, but if it were possible to, link some of those people up from different churches, again, maybe this sounds like it's sort of a crazy idea, but sometimes we have to start with crazy ideas.
All right. Does anybody else have any questions they'd like to ask Paul? We will have the recording from this webinar available, and maybe Paul will be able to send me his slides so that we can put that with the recording so you can take a closer look at some of the references he gave. And okay. All right. Should I go ahead and Courtney, did you have something?
Mindy,
Yeah.
I did.
Yeah.
So Paul, I'm curious. You talk about faith-based institutions, churches, but also, synagogues, mosques, Christian Scientists. I just wonder if do you think there's the same there could be the same support found in academic institutions? Like, do you think there would be, if you went to a university, there would be somebody in each university that could pick up this theme, this concern, this awareness, like the 5% you were talking about, right? That there would be just this small cohort of folks. And then you'd have a network around the country, around the world, of people who are doing this awareness raising, and then mitigation, or what do you even call it? As the temperature goes up, these people migrate, and then what? And a lot of them migrate from one country to another, right? Between countries.
A small percentage, but a large number.
Oh, really? Most of them migrate within their own country?
Yeah,
Did you say that? I missed that. I'm sorry.
yeah, it would be like, we don't have exact numbers, but just to, roughly speaking, in most cases, it would be like at least 95% stay in their own country, and usually be 5% or less. Like, it happens that in Guatemala
Okay.
and Nicaragua, there's a lot of international migration because of their situations. But let's say in Bangladesh or Philippines, there's not much because they don't have places to go, or for a variety of reasons.
Okay. And so what do you think about the academic community, sort of the academy being a part of this? Do you think they jump on this, or is this not their thing?
Well, the first thing is that the whole sort of incentive structure for academics is around publication,
Right.
philosophy teaching. So I got in touch with many scholars, who many of them presented at the symposium that I organized. And so, I think there's definitely a possibility. A few years ago, I actually started to try to organize a project like this, reaching out first, predominantly to academics, and I was just testing the waters. There was some level of interest, but my early efforts from a few years ago, and by the way, Jay Parsons and Marion, who are on this call, who are on the Zoom, I sort of roped them in as counselors for me. So they've been my retired sort of Marian's been praying for me, and Jay worked with the UN system, so he's been sort of giving me advice from that side of things. And so they've heard this story before about how my first efforts were not fruitful. I think that yes, both the church and also, scholars, particularly once scholars like myself, I've got tenure. I'm a full professor. I don't need to worry about, my academic kudos, um, qualifications and stuff. But the other interesting thing is that when we talk about climate justice and scholarship, that scholars tend to have a deep commitment to their own gestalt. And I actually do think that in terms of a sort of a broad commitment to climate justice for the sake of climate justice, like I do a lot of work on Rawlsian justice, John Rawls' theory of justice, in terms of the academic thing. And most scholars who work on Rawlsian justice don't even think about climate migrants, and it really has been coming from the UNFCCC side of things that the focus on climate migrants has been coming up, not from the academic side. So I think there's possibilities there, I don't see it as something where it would be easy to get substantial numbers, in the short term. I think that once you built up some momentum, then then uh, then some scholars, who are more sort of practically engaged might be interested. Also, I will say that I have a book that I'm working on it's due to the publisher in October, and I'm using climate justice as my case study in the book. And I'm talking about the need to work on climate migration in the book. So that might also serve the purpose of reaching out to academics.
Okay. Thanks for sort of going in that direction. I appreciate it. Mindy, I think is gonna
Yeah,
go
sorry, I
through the
didn't mean to
slides and
click
close.
that early while you were
No,
still
no, no.
talking. My
That's okay.
finger slipped. Okay. I'm just going to share a few of our upcoming events here, and then I will let Eileen pray us out. Here we go. So coming up next month, after General Assembly ends, we will be having an update webinar with Fred Milligan, who you heard a few minutes ago, and also some other people from Presbyterians for Earth Care and a partner organization, or Canopy, which is young adults, and possibly some others. We'll be talking about how what happens at General Assembly. As was mentioned, we're promoting 3 different overtures, but there will be that to discuss how that turns out, and possibly some other related topics. So you'll be able to register for that soon. And then the other one I wanted to mention for this summer is we are having Carrington Howard from Southern Alliance for Clean Energy talk to us about plug-in solar and opportunities for that in the future, allowing people in situations where they can't have rooftop solar to actually take advantage of solar energy. So she'll be coming to talk to us about that, and that will be in August. And just wanted to mention that we offer all of our webinars for free of charge, and you're welcome to make a donation through our website. And so,
And Mindy,
Go
I
ahead,
think
Fred.
Fred has
Fred has
a
his hand
comment.
up.
Just
I didn't see
before
it because I was sharing my slides. Go ahead,
before we
Fred.
pray out, I wanted to say anyone who is interested in speaking about any of our 3 overtures before the committee at General Assembly, which is held on Zoom, you wouldn't have to leave your home to do it. You will soon have access to information to sign up to speak in the open hearings. And so think about it and pray about it, and maybe one of those 3 overtures are something that you would have something important to say to the committee about.
And if you have questions about that in the meantime, feel free to email me on the email address on the website, and I will pass that along to the people in the advocacy committee if you had any
Thank you,
questions.
Fred.
Mhm.
Thanks.
Paul.
just a brief mention. I put my phone number in the chat.
Oh, thank you. So Fred, you can get that from the chat.
Please make sure you get it, Mindy, because I don't have
Okay.
anything to put it down
Okay,
on.
yes, I will. I will get it for you.
Fred, I just texted it to you.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Courtney. All right. Eileen, would you like to wrap us up?
Sure. I just want to say thank you, Paul. That was a wonderful presentation and so much to think about.
Thank
Really.
you, Judy.
Let us pray. Gracious God, we thank you for this time together, for new ideas, big ideas. Help us to think about what needs to be done. There's so much need in our world, and help us to figure out ways to respond to serve your people. Be with us as we go our separate ways this evening. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.
Thank you, Eileen. Thank you.